Hello, mentalists. So today we'll be talking about a bunch of arguments against psychoneural identity thesis. And now there's a bunch of different approaches to responding to psychoneural identity thesis. So it's going to be a little bit heavy today, but don't stress out too much. We will be going over these arguments again when we recap at the end of our unit on consciousness. One cool thing is that these are very interesting problems to talk about. So I look forward to discussing them with you in class. Let's get started. So today, one of the main problems we'll be talking about is the zombie problem. And the zombie problem is a problem for psychoneural identity thesis. Before we get into that, we should review some key terms. First of all, remember what the mind-brain identity thesis says? It says that for each type of mental state M, there exists a neural type N such that M equals N. So it's saying that for all mental states, there are neural states that are the same as them. Now, before I go into a little bit more on identity, remember, we talked about this very briefly in class, but I just want to put the definitions up here for you to look at. Remember that tokens are a particular instance of a property. So for example, the particular headache that I might have today, and it is true, I did have a migraine today. So that particular migraine the claim would be identical to a particular neural state. But mind-brain identity thesis is actually a claim about types of identities, about general kinds of properties. So it's not a claim about each specific headache that I have, although it entails that it is also a claim about the specific headaches that I have. It's a claim about the general kinds of things like pains and what they're identical to, which in this case would be general kinds of things, neural states. And now determining what sort of a property makes for a type or a kind like that depends on your theory of natural kinds, and this is an issue in philosophy of science that we won't have too much time to talk about in class, but just to give you a sketch, natural kinds are things that make sense to be grouped together according to a theory in natural science. So you might imagine that the definition of species tries to figure out what amounts to a natural kind, something that picks out a certain population of organisms that together have some biological characteristics in common. And if you were to find such a good definition of species, then you would have a definition of a natural kind. Now, you might know from philosophy of biology, or maybe you've taken some biology classes, that specifying a species is actually a little tricky because it turns out that many populations of organisms sometimes have like narrow bands of crossbreeding, which makes it difficult to determine exactly when you have distinct species and when you have subspecies of one large species that are just separate in their environments, and so they don't tend to breed. But we'll leave that to the biologist to figure out. The point is that that's an example of a natural kind. Another example of a natural kind are elements of the periodic table. Those are obvious and fairly straightforward natural kinds. Kinds of molecules are kinds of natural kinds. And maybe you can think of other examples. So the idea is that when we talk about this kind, pains, or type of property, we'd want to, if we were mind-brain identity theorists, identify those pain types with neural state or neural event types. And presumably neuroscientists would be able to identify such a class of properties that could be classed together as a natural kind. All right, so getting back to it, mind-brain identity thesis, again, is that each type of mental state or mental event M will be identical to a neural type or neural event type N, such that N equals N. The principle of necessity of identities, which will become important when we talk about Kripke's objection to mind-brain identity thesis, goes like this. There's two different kind of main claims that go into it. One of them says that if X equals Y in some possibility, in some possible world, then it must be the case that X equals Y in every possible world. And the second principle here says that if X equals Y is possibly false, that is, it's false in at least one possible world, then X equals Y is false overall. So the principle of necessity of identities is something that we call a modal law. It's basically saying that we can get information about the truth of a claim at a particular world on the basis of whether it's true across certain possibilities outside of that world. So the necessity part comes in when you realize that if the claim is false anywhere, then it's certainly false here. And that's only one kind of necessity. There's also deontological necessity, which wouldn't follow the principle of necessity of identities. But don't worry about that unless you're taking modal logic, or ask your logic teacher. Maybe they'd have fun explaining this. So basically the principle of necessity of identities says that if x equals y, then it's necessary that x equals y. And if possibly x does not equal y, then x cannot equal y at all. So thinking about the mind-brain identity thesis again, in order to show that pain is not the same as, for example, C fibers firing, it would suffice to show that pain is not the same as C fibers firing is possibly false. If you could show that pain could show up without any C fibers firing, then that would be enough to show that pain is not identical to C fibers firing. And so on and so forth for each mental event type and each neural event type that you might be interested in. If you can show that the mental event type could occur without that neural event type, then you don't have an identity. All right, so let's look at the causation argument for mind-brain identity. What's one additional reason to believe mind-brain identity? And it goes like this: the best way to make sense of mental causation, the idea that mental phenomena have real causal effects or consequences, is to accept mind-brain identity. So if you remember from what we talked about briefly in class, if you have a particular mental event type like pain in the elbow or hunger, that can only cause a jerky motion in my arm or a reaching for a sandwich or something like that. The mind-brain identity argument here says that it only makes sense that pains cause motion or that hungers cause motion if they're not just correlated with brain or neural events, if they're identical, right? Because then you can say that the pain, which is just the brain state, is causing the jerky motion. If you say that the pain is different from the brain state, then there's like a big question mark about whether there's two causes here for the motion. So this particular argument for mind-brain identity says that the only way to save pain or to save hunger or these other mental events as causes is to identify them with their relevant neural event type. We'll talk about this argument again when we talk about mental causation, but this is sort of one strong reason why mind-brain identity thesis gains some traction, at least metaphysically. Put formally, the previous argument says, 1, at least some mental phenomena have physical effects. 2, the physical domain is causally closed. What does this mean? First of all, any physical event that has a cause has a sufficient physical cause. So any physical event can be fully explained by there being a physical event before it that made it happen. Secondly, no physical event has a non-physical cause. So you won't be able to find like spooky ghost things or spooky fairy things happening that explain the causation of physical events. Thirdly, no physical event has a non-physical cause or effect. So any physical event has only physical causes and only physical effects. So we've got premise 1, premise 2, here's premise 3. Unless mental phenomena are identical with physical phenomena, they cannot have physical effects. So this is basically what we saw in this graph here, right? If your pain in the elbow, which is a mental event, were not identical to a neural event, it would be non-physical. But then because of this causal closure, this non-physical thing couldn't cause the motion in my arm. So unless mental phenomena are identical, are made identical to physical phenomena, they can't have physical effects, according to this argument. Therefore, the mind-brain identity thesis is true, or we should accept the mind-brain identity thesis. If we accept causal closure, we should accept mind-brain identity. So that should be enough for our recap. Now let's talk about an argument against mind-brain identity thesis. This is an argument postulated by philosopher David Chalmers. And I should note, he no longer has this long scraggly hair. It was kind of punk rock. He's cut it short. But this is David Chalmers. Chalmers says, you could conceive of there being something like a zombie. And now here we don't mean zombies like in those B movies that are kind of popular.
Persons who die during this crisis, from whatever cause, will come back to life to seek human victims.
Or the increasingly wilder treatments in the cinemas.
Welcome to Zombieland.
We don't mean beings that are hungry to eat brains.
Why do you eat people?
Not people. Brains.
We mean philosophical zombies. Philosophical zombies are beings that are physical duplicates of us, molecule for molecule identical to each one of us. But suppose that those physical duplicates of us could not have any experiences. They would behave just like we behaved. They would report the same emotions that we would report when seeing a painting, when eating a delicious piece of pie, when hanging out with their friends. They would have normal conversations. They'd report on their experiences. And for all intents and purposes, we would not be able to tell that they had no experiences. Chalmers thinks that we can conceive of this. We can imagine this situation, even if it seems sort of wild to us. It's just like the situation in which there would be androids that look just like us, but which we couldn't tell about, who behave just like us, but really maybe because they're made of some computational structure that's just seeming to replicate our mental states without actually replicating them. There's nothing going on up there, is what we say. And that's the sense in which they are zombies. They're philosophical zombies because there's nothing going up in their brain. They're not really, really human, or they're not really, really alive. They're just automata. And Chalmers says, because we can imagine this, it's a problem for physicalism. How is it a problem for physicalism? Well, let's go over this argument. So here's how this argument goes. The conceivability argument against physicalism. Premise 1. It's conceivable that there be zombies, beings just like us physically, but with no phenomenal experiences. Premise 2, if it is conceivable that there be zombies, it is metaphysically possible that there be zombies. Premise 3, if it is metaphysically possible that there be zombies, then consciousness is non-physical. So, conclusion, consciousness is non-physical. Now, you'll notice that there's some tricky moves going on here. So first of all, we've got to decide whether or not we agree with Chalmers that we can really imagine beings that are just like us physically, but with no phenomenal experiences. Second of all, we have to ask if it's sufficient for us imagining zombies, that means that it's metaphysically possible that there be zombies. So just because we can conceive of something being the case, is that enough for us to be able to say that there is some remote possibility, some like genuine possibility that this thing that we imagine might be the case occur? Now, you'll notice that the structure of this argument is very similar to Descartes' conceivability argument for mind-brain separation, right? For Descartes, if you can imagine something being the case, then God, because he's all-powerful, could make it be the case. And so in some sense, because he could make it be the case, then we've got a counterexample to the identity of minds and bodies. This is just the argument that Chalmers is making against mind-brain identity thesis. Because if it's possible that there be zombies, if it's possible that our experiences can come apart from our physicality, then consciousness is non-physical, right? Remember this, the principle of necessity of identities? That's what he's using. If possibly X is not equal to Y, then X is not equal to Y at all. And that's what we have here. If it's possible that our conscious states are not identical to our physical states, that is, Chalmers thinks that we can show it's possible because we can imagine it, then it would turn out that our conscious states are not identical to our physical states. So a somewhat more general version of this argument appeals to these terms. So suppose that P here, the letter P, stands for the conjunction of all microphysical truths about the universe. Everything about how the universe is arranged microphysically. And suppose that Q is an arbitrary phenomenal truth about the universe, an arbitrary truth about our conscious experience. And note here that the ampersand represents and, the logical statement and that symbol is the negation symbol. That symbol is the negation symbol. It represents not. So premise 1 of this argument says it is conceivable that P and not Q. That is to say, we can conceive that all of the microphysical truths about the universe hold, but that one thing that's true about our conscious experience is not in that conceivable world. Premise 2, if it's conceivable that P and not Q, it is metaphysically possible that P and not Q. Premise 3, if it is metaphysically possible that everything that's true about the microphysical universe is true, but something is off about the conscious states in that universe, then materialism is false. So, conclusion, materialism is false. This is just another version of the conceivability argument. Instead of talking about zombies, it just sort of takes a step back and says, just suppose that everything is microphysically the same in this alternate universe, and that only one arbitrary phenomenal truth is different or absent. It feels like we can imagine that being the case. If we can imagine that being the case, Chalmers thinks that that means that it's metaphysically possible. And if it's possible, then the identity thesis is false. So far, so good? All right. I think that this calls for talking a bit more about identity because it's metaphysically complicated. Some of you probably haven't taken a metaphysics class, and it's worth meditating on. Maybe if you've taken philosophy of language, you've discussed this text. So I had you read a section of Naming and Necessity, lecture 3 by Saul Kripke. This is a picture of Saul Kripke here on the right. And Kripke has a lot to say about identity. That's probably one of the biggest innovations in his theory of language. Now, when we talk about necessity and possibility and the logic of necessity and possibility, we call that modal logic. Modal is the word for these operations of necessity and possibility. So Kripke's modal logic. We start by defining this term that he came up with called a rigid designator. I know, funny jokes can be made. A rigid designator is a name that you give to something that, no matter what, is going to pick out that thing in every alternative possibility that you might talk about. So, for example, the name René Descartes is a rigid designator. What does that mean? It means that it picks out Descartes as the person we're talking about in every alternative possibility, no matter what we could change about the facts, as long as there was a dude there that corresponded to René Descartes in our imagining, that's the name. It's rigidly picking out Descartes in every alternative possibility that we might consider, including one where Descartes was named something different. So we would say Descartes could have been named Pelé. Suppose we said that. We would still be picking out the same person, even if we're talking about him possibly being named Pelé, because the him that could have been named Pelé is René Descartes, that person we've been talking about the entire time. So we can make sense of that sentence because René Descartes is a rigid designator, Kripke says. It picks out the same person no matter what other properties we might consider would be different about him. We might say René Descartes might never have written Meditations on First Philosophy, right? And we can understand that sentence, even though we might only know about Descartes because of his Meditations on First Philosophy. That's fine. We can conceive of the man Julius Caesar never having been an important figure in Roman history. You know, Julius Caesar's life might have gone very differently, and maybe we would have never heard about him. We can still talk about that possibility with Julius Caesar in it. So contrast this term, the rigid designator, with a non-rigid designator, which is a description or a descriptor that can be used to pick out an entity based on a property that can vary depending on the possibility. So, for example, the inventor of bifocals is a description. It's a non-rigid designator. Around here, in our world, it refers to Benjamin Franklin because he invented bifocals. But there would be someone it referred to in a different world if Benjamin Franklin did not exist, but bifocals did. So what this tells us is that the inventor of bifocals, that description, does not rigidly designate anybody because it could mean Benjamin Franklin around here. It might mean somebody else, Samuel Richardson or something, maybe in an alternative possibility, invented bifocals. So the inventor of bifocals doesn't pick out Benjamin Franklin. Same thing maybe with other descriptions, like the 44th president of the United States. Around here, it picks out Barack Obama. There are alternative possibilities in which Barack Obama would not have been president. And in those possibilities, the 44th president of the United States would have picked out somebody else. So far, so good. Now, suppose that you to think it is possible for minds to have existed without bodies, like ghosts floating around who have mental states, or for bodies to have existed without minds, like in the zombie case. If A, suppose it's a name, rigidly refers to the person Descartes, and B rigidly refers to the body that Descartes had, we're basically stipulating that A and B are rigid designators. Then, if A and B are identical, it would be necessary, based on the necessity of identities, for A and B to exist together. That is, it would be impossible for A to exist without B, or B to exist without A. We're getting to the argument now. If we want it to be the case that A could possibly exist without B, if God had to do work to make them happen together, they cannot be identical. They must only contingently exist together. Because if they're identical, right, there can't be any possibility where they come apart. So if we want a possibility where they come apart, then it must be contingent that A and B exist together around here. So now we come to Kripke's modal argument against mind-brain identity. Premise 1, suppose pain equaled C fibers firing. Suppose pain was identical to C fibers firing. And notice here, again, I just have to keep saying this, C fibers firing is just our placeholder for whatever neural event type we think is identical to pain's. Premise 2, pain, the name, and C fibers, the name, are both rigid names. By the necessity of identities, pain must be identical to C fibers firing in every possibility. Premise 4, but in some possible world, pain might not be identical to C fibers firing. Now ask yourself why. What is this possibility in which pain is not identical to C fibers firing?
Why?
The pain.
What about the pain?
The pain of being dead.
Can you think of an example? It doesn't have to be anything crazy like the zombie argument. It could just be, well, maybe you can imagine that robots feel pain, but robots don't have C fibers, right? Or we could build robots that don't have any neural events. If we think that robots could feel pain, then we think that there's some possibility in which pain was not identical to C fibers. And if that possibility held, then pain would just not be identical to C fibers. So this is a fundamental problem for mind-brain identity thesis. And Kripke has basically said, if the word pain is a rigid designator for this experiential thing, pain, and the neural event has a rigid name that designates it, but we can imagine that pains could arise without C fibers firing, then we have a problem with the identity thesis. So questions we can ask about this argument include, is pain really a rigid name, right? Could it be possible that my name for pain is non-rigid? It's just a description of something. It's a placeholder for the types of things that fit under a certain description. What do you think? Is pain a rigid designator? Here's another question. Is it really possible that pain could be non-identical to C fibers firing? Some people claim that they can't imagine what it would be for there to be pain without some neural event. Or some people think that just because we can imagine that pain might happen without a neural event doesn't mean that it's possible for pain to happen without a neural event. So perhaps our ability to conceive of possibilities shouldn't tell us whether or not they're really possible. Maybe we can imagine impossible things. And if so, then conceivability wouldn't be a guide to possibility at all. All right, so here's maybe a more nuanced point that is important to talk about just to get clear and avoid certain types of confusions. Notice that many people, not just mind-brain identity theorists, maybe you yourself, accept token identities between mental and physical events. Now remember back to our definition of token and type. Here it is. So a token is a particular instance of a type of property, like the particular migraine that I have today. And a type is a general kind of property. So for example, the class of things that hurt, pains. So many people accept that tokens of pains are identical to tokens of brain states. For example, this headache that I'm feeling right now is just identical to me being in a certain neurovascular state, call it NH. I only feel this headache when my body instantiates NH. The token property, being this headache, is identical to the property having this neurovascular state. So the particular is identical to the particular. If these identities hold, then it is not possible for me to be in this particular neurovascular state without having this particular headache. Identity theorists cannot claim that the pain, the headache, is contingent. This is a problem for Kripke. Why is it a problem for Kripke? Well, his argument is an argument about types. The type's pain cannot be identical to the type's C fibers firing if some pain tokens are not identical to C fibers firing. But notice how he seems like he has to be committed to the token identity claim. Being in this headache, how would you be in this particular headache without this neurovascular state? Am I claiming that there's a robot that could be in this particular headache, even though he doesn't have a brain? What is it that could hurt that was relevantly headache-like? So basically, how can he claim that the headache is contingent? Do you think he has a way out of this problem? So basically, the question we have is about type identities between mental and physical types of events. The question is, are all pains just certain kinds of neurophysical events? If you're a functionalist, and again, we'll talk about functionalism soon, but it's a kind of non-reductive physicalism. If you are a functionalist, clearly you would answer, no, not all pains are certain types of neurophysical events, because you would think some pains are certain sorts of events in circuits or silicone chips, in robots and androids and computers. And some pains are certain sorts of events in alien organisms who are not made up of cells with phospholipid bilayers, for example, and so on and so forth. Another way to describe this role functionalist view is as a non-reductionist. They don't think that the mental state type pains can be reduced to or identified with a physical state type. But they, like the mind-brain identity theorists, they agree that the token particular pains can be identical to token particular physical states. They just disagree that the type of mental states you could be in are identical to the types of neural states you could be in, because some mental state types are correlated with non-neural types. So we've probably been talking about this for long enough that it's not worth bringing up further objections against mind-brain identity thesis. But just in case, I'll leave them up here. So most of these problems for mind-brain identity that go beyond these metaphysical problems we've been talking about are epistemic objections. They have to do with how you know about your pains and how you know about your neural states, and how private your knowledge of your own mind is versus how unprivate your knowledge of your brain states are. And there's a further argument that's an epistemic argument, which we'll talk about later, which is the Mary the Vision Scientist case. It's a paper by Frank Jackson. Hold on for that argument. This further strategy against the mind-brain identity thesis is that you can't know your mental states the way that you know your physical states, and vice versa. You know them in different ways. So the brain theorists' reply strategy is there is one event or property or state or thing which can be known or accessed through two distinct ways, but they're the same thing anyway. So the fact that you access it in two epistemic ways doesn't make for a problem for identity. So look back at Smart's argument, and he's kind of anticipating this sort of epistemic objection already. All right, so that's all we have time for today. We've gone over numerous arguments. They might take some time for you to go through and understand, so feel free to rewatch any parts that you need to rewatch or reread any passages you need to reread. And I look forward to discussing this with you in class. Take care and have a lovely day.
Oh!